Welcome to episode 8 of West Meets East. Sorry for the delay. I've been sort of focusing on other social media. But I did want to sort of talk about my relationship with Martin, who was the man that I dated for 20 years before I met my current husband, Hui. I met Martin in 1991 while vacationing on Nantucket. And even during that first weekend, I knew that Martin had hepatitis C. That was something he had to tell me because, hepatitis C is contagious, specifically through sexual transmission. So even on the very first date or weekend, I knew about his condition. Now, Martin was aware of hepatitis C since 1975 when he contracted it, through IV drug use. He was a hippie. But hepatitis C at that time was called the silent killer because most people had it for years and years and years and did not know they had it because it wasn't randomly tested or regularly tested. And you didn't experience any side effects of it for 25 to 30 years. And that was the case with Martin. If he was contracted in 75, in 91, he still was not experiencing any symptoms. He would have regular checkups and he would meet with his doctor and they would monitor his liver enzymes and things like that. And he was fine. But he did know that eventually he was going to need a liver transplant, because he had hepatitis hepatitis C genotype 1, which at that time and until just very recently was the most difficult of hepatitis to cure. So he lived a fairly normal life with me from 91 until about 2001. And it was at that time that his liver enzymes became elevated and he started to experience some of the side effects that can come with hep C, including fluid in the abdomen and ascites and things like that. So we began to sort of discuss next steps. And the next step, unfortunately, was a liver transplant. So in 2005, he was really beginning to suffer the effects of the hepatitis C. His abdomen was expanding. He was becoming a little bit jaundiced. You could see the yellowing around his eyes. And so his doctors at Leahy Clinic in Boston said, okay, Martin, it's time to get a liver transplant. We'll put you on the liver donor list. But unfortunately, on the East Coast, there is sort of a shortage of organs just because we have a higher need for them. So he was going to actually move to Pittsburgh with some friends. He used to live in Pittsburgh because UMP, University of Medical Pittsburgh, had a pretty higher rate of transplants. But in the meantime, I had actually learned about live donor transplants. A live donor means that a donor, like myself, donates 2/3 or 66% of his liver to somebody else. The liver is the only organ in the body that actually regenerates. And so I said to Martin, look, rather than, at this time we were living in Maine, being apart while you're in Pittsburgh and I'm living in Maine, why don't I just get tested, as a donor? Now, there was only a 25% chance we would match. We don't even have the same blood type, but fortunately I have O positive, which is, a universal donor blood type. I think Martin had A, I don't remember. But I still had to go through a series of many, many tests. I had to have several dye contrast CT scans. I had to, have multiple x-rays. I had to have like a week of tests I had to go through. As luck would have it, I was a perfect match for donation. In fact, the liver has extra veins in it, vein configuration. And my liver actually had an extra vein that made the configuration and the connections even better for Martin. So then we had to make the decision, okay, do I go through this procedure? To me, it was no question in my mind. I was going to donate my liver. Martin was very, very nervous about it because there is some risk. And at that time in 2005, they had only been doing live donor donations for livers for a couple of years. And so it was still a little bit unknown what the long-term side effects would be for me. But, at this point, I had been with Martin over 10 years. I loved him a lot. And, I didn't want to see him die. And I didn't, there was always such a high chance he would not receive a cadaver liver before passing away. So in September, I think it was, no, October of 2005, we went to Leahy Clinic and we had the procedure. It was quite successful. I mean, the day after the surgery, Martin's color was back to normal. His fluid in his abdomen disappeared, and he felt better than he had in years. I, on the other hand, felt like crap. But they did tell me that the first few days would just be like the worst I've ever felt in my life. And they were pretty much right. But they said after about 5 days, it'll be like a light switch, and then suddenly I'll start to feel better. I still had to miss 9 weeks of work because it was quite an operation. And I do have a big ass half Mercedes scar on my abdomen where they took out my liver, or 2/3 of it. It was about a 5 or 6 hour procedure. So that being said, it was successful, and Martin had, he was back to living his full life again. But unfortunately, a liver transplant did not eliminate the hepatitis. He still had hepatitis C, and because he was on autoimmune suppressant drugs, the hepatitis had free rein to attack his new liver. He tried interferon and ribavirin several times. At one point, it actually did clear the hepatitis, and then we had to wait 6 months to check again that it had disappeared completely, and unfortunately, it did not. So in 2010, he began to experience the symptoms again. And in 2011, he went to an appointment in May at Leahy again, and they said, Martin, unfortunately, you're going to need another liver transplant because your levels are actually worse than they were in 2005. The East Coast did not do any second donor transplants because there was such a shortage on livers to begin with. So we had two choices. One was Memphis, the other one was Indianapolis. And we selected Indianapolis. Martin was not keen on having a second transplant. I think he was prepared to just live out his last couple of years. But, he had a 50% chance of surviving a second transplant, and we knew that there was a cure for hepatitis C in the pipeline, and so we really wanted to try to make it happen. So he had the second transplant in August of 2011, but unfortunately, there were so many unknowns. One of them is that there was so much scar tissue from the first transplant that the connections they needed to make with the hepatic and portal veins were never very good, and the draining of the liver just was never very successful. And unfortunately, he had complication after complication after complication. It ended up that he was in the ICU for almost 184 days, or 6 months. I was a principal at a high school in Maine, and I was trying to manage his care in Indianapolis while running a high school in Maine. It was almost an impossible task. I missed over 50 school days that year, but at that point, I didn't care. Near the end, Martin was really beginning to decline. And at one point, they had to remove his central line because it was clogged. And they needed to re-establish the central line because, my God, he was hooked up to like 24 different IVs. And without that central line, there was no place to run all the lines. So that morning, while he was sort of out of it, he kept raising his arms up like this. And I'm like, Martin, what are you doing? He's like, what? I said, what are you doing? Put your arms down. He goes, oh, I thought I saw my mother. And then 10 minutes later, he did it again. And I said, Martin, your arms are up again. What's going on? He goes, oh, I thought I saw my friend Sam. Sam was his best friend who had died a couple of years before. So that should have been my first clue that something was going on. And then when they took him out of the hospital room to bring him into the procedure room for his central line, he pointed at me like this very emphatically. And he said, remember our agreement. And I said, yes, Martin, I remember. And that agreement was that if anything were to happen, not to resuscitate him. He did have a DNR, but it was unfortunately not a legal DNR in Indianapolis or Indiana. And I never had a chance to change that. So we're back in the procedure room. I'm like petting his head, and I said, Martin, are you ready for this? And he sort of nodded. And then before you knew it, I just watched his eyes just kind of like click like this, just like doll eyes. And even before the machines went off, I said, Doctor, there's something wrong. And then the flatline noise came on. It was like something out of a cinematic movie. Suddenly, I was no longer by his side. I was pushed to the other side of the bed, and the doctor's like, get the crash cart. Everything was chaotic, and it was like the camera was just spinning around me, and I was like, all I can hear was that loud beeping from the machines, and everything was a blur. I was just like, my eyes were like going from the doctor to Martin to the machine, and they're holding up the paddles like this, and the doctor said to me, are we going to do this? And I was so out of it. I was like, do what? And they're like, are we going to resuscitate him? And I'm like, well, what's the chance of bringing him back? And I will never forget this, and I'm entirely grateful to the doctor for saying it, because it was the reminder that I needed. He said, to what? So that was the right answer, because it's really hard to make that decision for somebody, but it was the right decision to make. And so I turned to the doctor. I said, you're right. He went without realizing, I think, he was going to go. So there was no fear involved. And at this point, he was already gone. It's amazing how quickly the body loses its body temperature. He was already getting cold to the touch. But, after that, everything happened very quickly. They asked me to leave the room so they could clean him up. And then they told me to come back in 20 minutes, which I did. And then they said, okay, you can say your goodbyes. And I just remember standing in that room, and all I did was ask out loud, what do I do now? What do I do now? And I just kept pacing the room. And I think I paced the room for 45 minutes until the nurse finally came in and hugged me and said, it's really time to go. So, yeah, that was 13 years ago this February. I've told the story many times, and it still gets me emotional. But I have no regrets about this. And if people ask me if I would redo my life knowing what I know would happen, my answer is absolutely yes, because Martin taught me so many lessons, and I come away from this experience with only one emotion, and that is gratitude. You always wonder what kind of person you're going to be in a crisis. How are you going to respond? Are you going to step up and do what needs to be done? Or are you just going to flee? Or are you just going to shut down? And, it turns out that I was the kind of person to step up. And I was there for Martin. And, when I watched him leave this earth, it was less scary, the whole thought of death for me, and I walked away with life lessons, and one of those lessons is patience. I was never the very most patient person. Martin was way more patient than me, and I've also sort of learned to forgive. Forgiveness is like the number one thing you can do for your own mental health. You don't always have to like the person you forgive, and you're not forgiving that person for them. You're forgiving it for yourself, because you're not carrying away these burdens with you. So I thank Martin for my current relationship with we, because if it wasn't for him and for the lessons that he taught me during our 20 years together, I wouldn't have been able to apply those lessons to my current husband. And without those life lessons, we probably would have broken up. But because I learned through Martin how to enter into a meaningful, committed relationship, we're able to stay together. So, yeah, that's the story about Martin. I will always remember him and love him and thank him for all that he gave me, even though he did die at the age of 58, which is 3 years younger than I am now. And, it's just hard for me to accept that sometimes. But some good news did come out of it. They do now have treatments for hepatitis C genotype 1. It's a pill. You take it in 6 weeks, it's cleared. So thank you, modern medicine. It came a little bit too late for us, but it was patients like Martin that were able to try out these medications that allow people for today to clear that terrible disease.